The approach we take in this report is not to take a position on how or when China might choose to move against Taiwan, what the cause of this rupture may be. We just imagine a break-glass political scenario. We imagine a world in which China takes an action such that there is a bipartisan consensus in the United States that something fundamental has changed and the economic relationship cannot continue as it once was. We can all exercise our imaginations about what that might be. But we would suggest that regardless of whether it's an invasion scenario, a blockade, or something else, a few things are likely. One is that there would be a global financial market shock, not only because trade flows in and out of China or in and out of Taiwan might be disrupted for as long as fighting would last, but also because there would be substantial uncertainty about how a conflict might escalate and what the United States might do in the way of sanctions or embargoes or something else that might aggravate the economic shock. So a lot of uncertainty about the future of the global economy, both in the short and the long term. Finally, we're talking about significant follow-on implications from the disruptions to supply chains. We can all remember the COVID experience where shortages of a few chips or intermediate components shut down production for entire auto supply lines. We're talking about this, but at a vastly larger scale, with implications for employment, for prices, a combination of factors that put central banks, by the way, in a very difficult position. We're talking about a situation where the United States and its allies and partners would probably say, oops, there's some critical production where we depend on China still, and we need to take that production back as soon as possible, whether because China has shut off exports of this good or that good, or because we believe we can no longer be dependent on a country that is now our adversary to produce something upon which we rely. So in the crisis, there are many ways you can imagine it going, and it's very hard to put numbers on what the situation would be. But I think we can say with some confidence that the US government and its allies would face two interrelated challenges. First, they would have a number of priorities related to the immediate crisis. Second, they would have to imagine a longer-term question of how they would reimagine the global economic order. Because if China did choose to cross US red lines in this way, it would not just be a story about Taiwan. It would be a story about China moving against a global order, including a rules-based trading system. And if a conflict resulted in the destruction of that system, it might prove very, very challenging to rebuild. So in this context, we think we can say with some confidence that the US would have at least 5 relevant economic interests. The first, as I've already mentioned, is preventing the meltdown of the US economy and financial system, and moreover, preventing global financial meltdown because the United States would not be insulated from that. Second would be the goal of breaking US dependence on PRC production, and also, and this is a harder question, but equally important, helping US allies and partners like the UK, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others to break their own dependence on China so that they wouldn't be vulnerable to coercion. Third, the United States would have this interest in maintaining a functional rules-based trading system. And this isn't just highfalutin language about the liberal international order. It is very practically about how the United States, after a Taiwan crisis was resolved, would be able to continue to trade with its friends and partners. Fourth, the US would have an interest in maintaining the role of its currency, which is so central to the global financial system and to global trade. Again, this isn't just about the principle of the matter. It's also because dollar hegemony is, at the end of the day, what enables the US government to enforce sanctions, export controls, and so forth, things that prevent dangerous dual-use components from falling into the hands of countries like Russia, North Korea, and possibly China as well. Finally, we might have an interest in punishing China, not just out of a sense of vengeance, but out of a clear-eyed political calculus of pushing China to the negotiating table so we could resolve whatever crisis we faced. And that would be a legitimate interest in the scenario that we're talking about. The point that Hugo and I are making is it would not be the only relevant US interest. It would have to be balanced against the rest. And moreover, most of the world might not agree with, but would at least recognize that the first four interests were legitimate. It would be much harder to get the rest of the world on the same page with the idea that punishing China was such a high priority that their own economic interests should be subordinated to it. And this is the problem with the discussion about contingency planning today. Because too often, as Hugo said, the discussion proceeds from the assumption that if China moved against Taiwan, Taiwan's so important that we would do a Russia plus style thing, that we would throw the book at China and do everything we could to restrict their ability to trade with the world. But not only can China learn from Russia's experience, China has vastly more resources and has done a much longer term and more careful job preparing for such a shock. China has the world's largest oil reserves, almost 1 billion barrels in their strategic petroleum reserves. And they have stockpiles of food and pretty much any other commodity you can think of. China imports a lot, including food. But that dependence on imports is illusory. China used to be self-sufficient in food. China started importing stuff like meat because the population got rich enough to start buying nice steaks from Australia and New Zealand. They could go back to being self-sufficient if they wanted to.